Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Jo Tyndall. I'm Director at the Environment Directorate in the OECD. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's OECD Green Talk Live for the launch of our new report on policy scenarios for eliminating plastic pollution by 2040. Now, we all know plastics offer a host of benefits for society. We can't really imagine a world now without them. But our insatiable appetite for plastics has meant that the production and use of plastics has risen exponentially in recent decades. Population and economic growth have driven up global plastics production, which has nearly doubled, soaring from 234 million tonnes in 2000 right up to 453 million tonnes in 2020, and of course, more since then. Almost all of that comes from new production of plastics using fossil fuels. Now, most of these plastics end up as waste. When not safely managed, this leads to severe negative consequences for the environment, human health, economies, and for our livelihoods. I'm sure many of you have all seen and are as alarmed as I am at headlines in the media alerting us to plastic particles that are found in the water, in the air we breathe, and in every part of the globe. In addition, health impacts occur all over the value chain, including through exposure to harmful chemical additives and air pollution from waste generation, especially for vulnerable communities. Current policies have so far failed to curb plastic pollution, and it's in this context that we have seen calls for greater ambition. To meet the need for broader action, member states of the United Nations have been negotiating a new global treaty to end plastic pollution. They started that in late 2022. The fifth and final round of negotiations is going to take place at the end of November in Busan, Korea. The OECD's cutting-edge modelling can play a key role in informing this critical stage of the negotiations. Some questions: what types of interventions are required to end plastic pollution? How can countries make informed decisions about the environmental benefits and economic impacts of current policy choices on the future of plastic pollution? Our new report provides some answers and some valuable insights on how countries can secure a more sustainable plastics economy. And to present the key findings, we're delighted to be joined by its authors today, Elena Buzzi, Junior Policy Analyst, and Rob Dellink, Senior Economist, both here in the OECD Environment Directorate. And following this presentation, we'll hear reactions and insights from two discussants. We'll be delighted to welcome very warmly Rob Harty from the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the United Kingdom, and also by Stanislav Stefan Ngoba from Environment and Nature Protection, Gabon. After these interventions, we're going to open the floor for questions. This Green Talks Live webinar is going to be moderated by Shardul Agrawala, who's head of the Environment and Economy Integration Division here at the OECD's Environment Directorate. Now, for those who are joining online, you can send questions at any time during the event using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will try to address as many as possible within the time available. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Elena and to Rob, who will now present an overview of this great new report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you all again for joining us today. So I would like to start our presentation by providing you with just some key numbers on the current situation on plastics and plastic pollution. We've seen in recent history the production and use of plastics grow very quickly, up to an estimated 435 million tons in 2020. This corresponds to about a doubling in levels of plastics use and plastics waste generation compared to just 20 years before, between the year 2000 and the year 2020. And although we obviously use plastics widely because these materials bring many advantages and benefits, this fast growth in their use also comes with severe consequences. To give you just one indicator of environmental impacts, we estimated in our report that more than 150 million tons of plastics have already been lost in rivers and oceans. So the situation here at the moment, it's pretty bleak. However, as we just heard, the good news is that countries have recognized that we need to take urgent action. The negotiations for a treaty following Resolution 514 of March 2022 are currently underway, and they're expected to conclude by the end of 2024. So we're really in a critical moment right now where we can shape the direction of policy action for the near and distant future. And the OECD has been engaged into these conversations and has been providing input into treaty negotiations already, specifically with the data and policy insights that were contained in the Global Plastics Outlook publications that also came out in 2022. However, as the negotiations for a treaty progressed, we wanted to use our data and leverage our modeling methodology further to provide further insights on some of the key questions that were coming up in the context of negotiations. And so this is the rationale for the report that's being launched today. What we did in this report is we developed a range of policy scenarios that are intended to loosely reflect a range of policy issues that came up in the context of negotiations. And by contrasting alternative scenarios, we gained some insights on mainly three things. First, what are the environmental consequences and benefits of going in different directions in terms of policy ambition internationally? Second, what might be the associated implications? And third, also, what are the priorities that we see ahead for policymakers, and specifically, what are the challenges that we think will need to be overcome if we are to achieve the goal of ending plastic pollution? I should also mention that for these reports, we're using the methodology that was developed for the Global Plastics Outlook reports. This is a sophisticated methodology that has a global scope and that allows us to link economic activity to the drivers of plastics use and then plastics flows through the economy, and then selected environmental impacts. And now moving on to how we conceptualized these policy scenarios. Well, first, we considered a range of 10 core policy instruments in the analysis. And these instruments target different stages of the life cycle of plastics as we model it in the analysis. And as such, we categorize the instruments into four main policy pillars. A first pillar looks at interventions focused on curbing the production and demand for plastics. And here we mostly model taxes to discourage the use of plastics. A second pillar really focuses on promoting the eco-design of plastic products to promote higher circularity. Here we have criteria for the eco-design of plastics, notably for longer lifespans, for higher durability, bans on selected single-use plastics, and also some material substitution. And then we have two more pillars that look more at the downstream stage, so more linked to the waste management side. So a pillar focusing on promoting improvements in recycling, which includes both targets to encourage the use of recycled plastics in new products, as well as interventions to improve the sorting and recycling of plastic waste, and extended producer responsibility schemes, both for packaging and for durable plastic products. And then lastly, the fourth pillar focuses really on improving waste management and also has some interventions to improve the management of municipal litter. So that's an overview of the instruments that we considered. let me now explain how the scenarios, the 5 scenarios that we developed, differ from one another. So as I mentioned, the scenarios are intended to chart or to visualize different possibilities for policy ambition on plastic pollution. And as such, they vary along 3 key dimensions that we identified as critical currently in the ongoing discussions for a treaty. The first dimension that we considered is the degree of policy stringency. So essentially, the objectives that we set for the instruments that I just showed you. And here, policy stringency goes from a business as usual level that you see in white in the first circle on the slide. Then we have possibility of low stringency. In this example of the slides, the second circle covers all pillars that I just showed you with a low or intermediate degree of policy stringency. And then the third case is one where, again, we have all pillars considered in a policy scenario with a high degree of policy stringency. Then moving to the second dimension that we considered, we differentiated some scenarios according to the scope of the life cycle scope of policies considered. So essentially, we compared the scenarios where there was a strong focus on waste management, so only considering the 2 blue pillars, compared to a scenario where all of the 4 pillars along the life cycle are considered. And then the third dimension is the differentiation along in terms of geographical coverage. So here we looked at an example where only a selection of countries, and we took advanced economies as an example, implement the 4 pillars with high stringency, while the rest of the world remains on business as usual. And we compare this to a case where instead there is global alignment on action along the 4 pillars. So this is a brief explanation of how we conceptualize the scenarios, but we're going to go into more details later as we present the results. Now, moving into the actual findings from the analysis. The first key message is that, well, business as usual is unsustainable. We expect that if we continue on the current trajectory of policy action, the production and use of plastics is going to continue to increase and reach about 736 million tons by 2040. And importantly, we also expect that the vast majority of these, above 95%, would still be met with primary plastics. Correspondingly, the generation of waste would also increase by about 70% between 2020 and 2040, going above 600 million tons by 2040. And even though we do expect some improvements in waste management systems all over the world, these improvements are likely to be insufficient to deal with the ever-increasing amounts of waste. And so as a consequence, we expect that in 2040, about 119 million tons of plastic waste would still be mismanaged or not managed in a safe and proper way. This is, of course, very worrying, and it's also interesting to then look at the regional breakdown of where the fastest growth in mismanaged waste would be likely to occur. So we saw, as you can see on the right-hand side chart, we found in our business as usual scenario results that the fastest increase in mismanaged waste would likely occur in sub-Saharan Africa and India. So regions where we expect rapid economic growth in the next decades. And also, to some extent, a catch-up in plastics use and plastic waste generation towards levels that we are seeing today in OECD countries. However, because these regions often do not yet have waste management systems that can safely take care of all of this waste, it's likely that they're going to be negatively affected by increasing amounts of mismanaged waste by 2040. This, of course, paints a bad picture in terms of environmental impacts, which are projected to amplify over the next 15 years. Looking at leakage of plastics to the environment, we expect that this would increase to about 30 million tons by 2040, and about a third of this leakage would be to aquatic environments. And then to give you a second pointer on environmental impacts, we also looked at greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics life cycle. So these mainly come from the production and the conversion stage of plastics, although the end-of-life phase also has a contribution. And we estimated that without additional policies, greenhouse gas emissions from plastics would almost double and constitute by 2040 about 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you very much, Elena. I'll take over from here to give you a brief glimpse of the types of results we're getting for the policy scenario analysis. Now, this is just a small glimpse. We have much more detailed results in the report, but we have limited time here. So just to recap, in the baseline, as Elena just said, we have on the left, you can see a rapid increase in production and use, with the striped area representing secondary materials, secondary plastics, but the vast majority being primary plastics. Then in the middle, you see the rapid increase in waste of plastics, and from that then derives an increase in the leakage of plastics. So let's look into the policy scenarios that we have. The first scenario that we investigate is called the global downstream high stringency scenario, which is kind of a code word for what you see in the diagram on the top right, which is that for the more upstream or midstream types of policy pillars, curbing global production and demand and designing for circularity, you have basically business as usual and you have no increase in policies. Whereas for the downstream measures on enhanced recycling and closed leakage pathways, we get the full stringency, the high stringency of those actions. So if you look at what that scenario then means in terms of the results, we can see that for production and use, there's only very little reduction in total plastics use because there is no upstream measure to curb demand. But there is, because we're enhancing recycling here, there is a significant shift towards secondary plastics. But the large volume of plastic still means that there is also a large volume of plastic waste that you see in the middle diagram. And then on the right, that means that with these significant amounts of waste that are being generated, we estimate that it's going to be impossible, even with stringent policies downstream, it's going to be impossible to eliminate all leakage. Basically, in Dutch, we have the expression that says you're mopping with the you're mopping with the water still on, and that's basically what's happening here. You're generating much more waste, and that basically exceeds the capacity of the waste management systems, even with stringent policies. So then on to a second scenario, which we call advanced economies life cycle high stringency. It's quite a mouthful. Basically, what this says is advanced economies will have ambitious high stringency action, but the rest of the world are staying at business as usual levels. And in this case, you see very little happening at global level. You see some reduction in production and use, some reduction in waste, but especially for leakage, you see very little reduction in leakage at the global level and well above 2020 levels. Then the third scenario is global life cycle low stringency. This is where we have a low stringency adopted along the whole life cycle and along all regions in the world. But it's those scenarios where this is the scenario where you have less stringent action, lower taxes, less EPR, less eco-design, and less recycling efforts. So this gives us, again, some action, a bit similar to the advanced economies life cycle high stringency scenario. There's a little bit of a reduction in production and use, a little bit of reduction in waste, and a little bit of reduction in leakage below baseline 2040 levels, but certainly not below 2020 levels. So all these three partial emission scenarios do not end leakage to the environment. None of them reach the goal of reducing leakage well below acceptable levels. So then the fourth scenario we're looking at, which we call global life cycle mixed stringency, is basically taking these three scenarios, these three partial scenarios all together and do them all. So the advanced economies do ambitious policies, high stringency policies throughout the life cycle, whereas the rest of the world does ambitious policies and high stringency for the downstream pillars, but lower stringency for the upstream pillars. And then we see that we do get indeed this shift towards secondary materials as in the downstream scenario. We do get a further reduction in waste. But again, as in the downstream scenario, it's just if you're managing waste not well enough to be able to manage all the waste that is generated in a sound manner, and so leakage to the environment remains. So the only scenario that we have that actually solves this problem is the global life cycle high stringency scenario, which we also call global ambition, because this is the scenario with high stringency along the life cycle at global level. And in that case, you do see a reduction in production and use, and actually you see that primary production, which is the non-shaded area on the left, is below 2020 levels, so there's a reduction in primary production. There is still some increase in plastic waste, but this is sufficient to then be able to eliminate virtually all leakage. So let me go down a little bit more in detail on that, on this leakage in this global ambition scenario. So we have these 10 policy instruments grouped into the 4 pillars, and we can look at the contribution of these different pillars for the final result. So the first one on curbing production and demand, that basically reduces waste streams and makes it easier to manage the waste when it gets to end of life. And that reduces to eliminating leakage by reducing the pressure on the waste management system. Similarly, designing for circularity and, for example, substituting away from plastics to alternatives, then also contributes another 15% to the reduction of leakage. A slightly stronger contribution is given by enhancing recycling and switching from primary to secondary, because that also improves the waste management systems. But the biggest part comes directly from the downstream measures to close leakage pathways. So improved collection and improved waste management, and also increasing litter collection rates. So that gives us 96% reduction of leakage compared to the baseline. And that's not 100. We talk about ending leakage. It's not 100% because there's always some streams of plastics that are not captured by waste management systems. And here you can think of uncollected litter that is basically just impossible to avoid the leakage of. So part of this story is then ending leakage, but part of the story is also reducing global plastics use for primary plastics. And this is the profile that we see over time at a global level. And this is important that this plastics use goes down, because primary plastics production is associated with a range of pollution effects, and not least greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing primary plastics production can contribute to improved environmental outcomes. And the way to do that is to make this shift towards secondary plastics. So for that, we need a rapid increase in recycling rates, which is the dots that you see in green. And the dashed area shows you the increase in the secondary plastics that can be generated from these increased recycling. And this is important because curbing demand is not very easy to do. We have very stringent policies in our policy scenarios, but this is still, there is such a demand for plastics and such an increase in the baseline that it's very hard to reduce plastics demand overall in the coming decades. So then on to the economic implications. So if we look at the macroeconomic cost of the policy package at global level, we find a reduction in GDP in 2040 of 0.5%. Now, this is in the context of a 1, 2, or even 2% GDP growth per year between now and 2040. So 0.5% from the 2040 level in the baseline is a lot of money, but it's not a dramatic outcome. We call this modest. And if you look at it for the different OECD regions, you see that these costs are indeed, in most cases, lower than 0.5%, except for what we call OECD LAC, which is the OECD countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there you see you have a little bit less advanced waste management system and therefore a slightly higher cost of reaching the elimination of plastic leakage. On the other hand, if we look at non-OECD countries, we do see higher costs in several of these regions, and that's especially, as Elena also mentioned, especially in regions that are fast growing and that have currently relatively weak waste management system. And the one that stings out most is the sub-Saharan Africa, where we find 1.5% GDP loss from baseline levels. That still doesn't mean that all economic growth in Africa will be wiped out. It is still much smaller than the baseline growth, but it is a significant economic cost. So if we then transition from macroeconomic costs to waste management costs, we have here a graph that compares the reduction in plastics leakage with the cumulative waste management costs for the period 2020 to 2040. Now, in baseline, we already see that more than $2 trillion is needed for investment in waste management, just because to keep track of all the waste that is generated. Now, if you do a global downstream high stringency scenario, so you're focusing purely on the downstream part and you're ignoring those incentives to reduce waste generation, you get some reduction in plastic leakage, but you also get a significant increase in waste management costs. And the reason for that is that you have higher costs for enhancing recycling and you have higher costs for closing leakage pathways, but there's basically no benefits from upstream policies to counteract that. So the total costs are increasing quite rapidly, and especially in non-OECD countries. In contrast, if you do a global life cycle high stringency, the global ambition scenario, you get a much bigger reduction in leakage and actually at a lower waste management cost. And the reason for that is that you can basically redirect investment flows. You have less waste than in the baseline. So some of the funds investments that in the baseline would go to waste collection can now go to improved waste management. And then for OECD countries, we then see that that's actually sufficient and there's no net investment further needed. In non-OECD countries, we do find that because to close the leakage pathways, there's a positive cost still there. We do see a fairly modest 50 billion increase over the 20-year period, still in addition to redirecting waste management flows. So what are then the priorities ahead? We've identified 3 types, major challenges to be overcome. There are significant technical, economic, and governance barriers. We highlighted the environmental benefits of this global ambition, but it doesn't come automatically. It requires dedicated interventions from governments, and it requires well-functioning markets, etc. So we need improved eco-design and large-scale recycling that requires innovation and harmonization of eco-design criteria, for example. Currently, not all countries have well-functioning waste collection and management systems, and these need to be ramped up. And it's especially if you have a 2040 deadline, there's basically only 15 years left to do that. So it needs to be a very rapid improvement that's needed there. Also, recycling losses currently, basically half of all the recycling that is collected is not actually recycled and not converted into scrap for various reasons. And these recycling losses need to be reduced. And the scrap markets are underdeveloped currently and need to be further developed also internationally. Secondly, significant financial resources and international cooperation are essential. We need to mobilize diverse sources of public and private finance. ODA flows are increasing, but it's not enough yet, and we definitely need more finance flows. We need to enhance financing, especially for developing countries, and we need to strengthen technical cooperation, capacity building, and technology transfer. And finally, we're talking here mostly about ending plastics leakage, but plastic pollution is, of course, much wider than that. We are not looking into details on how to combat the other aspects of plastic pollution, but we feel that we should make you aware that this does mean we need targeted interventions to reduce microplastics pollution, chemicals of concern. All the plastics that's still leaking into the environment until 2040 means that stocks of plastics in the environment, including in the aquatic environment, are still increasing. So these need to be cleaned up. And dedicated mitigation policies are needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to levels that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So very briefly, the key takeaways: business as usual is unsustainable. The global ambition as globally implemented stringent policies all along the life cycle does deliver the largest benefits, but we do need all these pillars that we talked about, all these different instruments. We need to work upstream, midstream, and downstream together in order to eliminate plastic leakage. The global ambition comes at a modest cost overall, but there's an uneven distribution across countries, which means financing issues for developing countries especially. And the focus on downstream measures only is less cost effective. It is less effective in terms of reducing plastic leakage, but it's also just more costly. And finally, plastic pollution is eliminated only when technical barriers are overcome and international cooperation is strengthened. So our report is out as of this afternoon. There's a QR code here presented, and there's also a URL that you can type in to get a copy of this report. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rob and Elena, for this fascinating presentation. And I see that the Q&A has been quite active with a lot of engagement from the audience. But I'm going to hold on the questions for the moment and invite our two discussants to first give their remarks. So our first discussant is Robert Harty, who is the United Kingdom's focal point for the international plastics negotiations, and he's from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Robert, I just wanted to ask you, what are your key takeaways from the report, and how do you think this analysis could be useful in supporting your country, but also other countries in the context of the plastics negotiations? I'm also keen to hear what insights might be particularly relevant with regard to both specific concerns countries might have, but also what might be possible opportunities, both at the domestic and the international level, that need to be addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Shardul, and also thank you to Elena and Rob for their presentation and the OECD for preparing this report. The report's coming out at a really crucial time. INC5 starts in about 8 weeks' time, and we'll be heading out to Busan. And here in the UK, we're in the middle of our preparations. So we'll be studying this report and its findings very closely to ensure that our negotiating positions are informed by the most up-to-date evidence. And I hope that the other negotiators watching will also consider its findings and take them into account as part of their preparations. In terms of the key takeaways, I think Rob summarised them quite well, but I'll pick out a few that stood out to me. And that's firstly that the current policy trajectory is simply unsustainable, that the production and use of primary plastics, will increase by almost 70%, and that waste management capacity can simply not keep pace with the growth of waste, and that leads to an increase of almost 50% of mismanaged plastic waste, which has a similar increase of 50% of that plastic leaking to the environment. And we know that that can have devastating impacts for the environment, for ecosystems, for people, for the economy, and also for climate mitigation. I think it was mentioned in the report that the contribution of plastics towards the climate crisis will continue to increase, I think, to almost 5% of the total global share of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, which is something that does need to be addressed. So we can see that plastic pollution is an issue that does need to be urgently addressed. And that leads me to my second takeaway, that global action across the plastic life cycle is required to end plastic pollution. I'd like to recall the mandate and the title of the UNEA Resolution 514, which is to end plastic pollution. That should be the goal of the INC, to agree agreement that can end plastic pollution. And this report shows that downstream measures that improve global waste management, or a patchwork approach where some countries implement different levels of obligations, they do help. They do reduce mismanaged plastic waste and leakage, but they don't go far enough. They won't eliminate it entirely. Only globally coordinated action with common global rules that address the full life cycle of plastic. That's the only way we can end plastic pollution or come close to it. And this report is somewhat of a roadmap for negotiators. It shows us that we need to reduce the production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to a sustainable level, phase out or restrict problematic and avoidable products, and design those products with circularity in mind. Dealing with plastic waste and plastic pollution is much more manageable if you address its key drivers first. So those upstream measures alongside those downstream measures, improving waste management practices and capacity. The upstream and the downstream measures together can virtually end plastic pollution. I think 96%, as Rob said. Another profound insight from the report is that the high ambition scenarios across the full life cycle of plastic does have modest cost, but big environmental benefits, and would actually cost less than focusing on downstream action. So I'll just repeat that point. High ambition scenario will cost less than a lower ambition scenario. The highest ambition scenario, the global ambition scenario, will cost about 0.5% of global GDP loss compared to the baseline by 2040, whereas the global downstream scenario costs about 0.8% in global GDP loss. And we know that's because the largest costs come from the collecting and sorting of mismanaged waste. So if you're addressing the amount of waste that is being generated, you reduce the costs. Again, acting against those drivers of plastic pollution brings down the costs in the long term. It's important to acknowledge that those costs are unevenly distributed. Sub-Saharan African countries will face larger costs, but overall, reducing the amount of waste does offset those costs for most countries. So those are some of the specific concerns. We know that Sub-Saharan African countries will face just the biggest costs, and that small island developing states and least developed countries are disproportionately impacted, and that is a legitimate concern. There's only a finite amount of international public finance available, and that needs to be targeted to be effective and used where it is needed most. But the treaty can bring opportunities that can catalyse finance and investment through setting a clear policy trajectory, common global rules that businesses have called for that can incentivise and enable them to invest in a circular economy for plastics. That certainty alongside public funding, ODA, public-private partnerships, and blended finance can de-risk those investments from the private sector. And one final takeaway that I have is that this report is corroborated and reinforced by other similar reports. The Global Plastic Outlook, which the OECD produced 2 years ago, the Nordic Council report, which came out last year, Systemic's Plastic Treaty Futures work, and the modelling conducted by the University of California, Santa Barbara. They all have essentially the same findings or point in the same direction, and that's that the current policy trajectory is unsustainable, and that only global ambition across the full life cycle of plastics is capable of ending plastic pollution. So that sends a big signal to me as a negotiator about what's required at INC 5. But thanks.
Thanks very much, Robert, for those observations. And indeed, I mean, the final point that you made is that this report, together with our earlier report, the Global Plastics Outlook, as well as reports by other organizations, are all pointing to a very similar message that business as usual is quite unsustainable, and coordinated global approaches throughout the life cycle are perhaps our best shot at addressing leakage and eliminating it. Let me now invite another INC negotiator, Stanislas Steven Mopa, who's the Director General, Environment and Nature Protection of Gabon, and you're also the focal point for the INC for your country. So Stanislas, I would now like to invite you to give your reflections on some of the key takeaways from the report, how they might be relevant for you both in a domestic context and in the context of international negotiations. But I'd also like to get some insights from you, especially on the need for financial resources for developing countries, which might be particularly stretched in terms of putting in place all these measures across the life cycle, and what you might view as the key challenges to, as well as the most promising routes to mobilize the necessary financial resources. So Stanislas, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to join that conversation, and I would like to thank OECD for organizing these talks and giving us the opportunity to exchange with colleagues and comment this report. And I also commend the report and the quality of the work that have been done based on also the previous OECD Outlook report on plastics. Regarding your first question, one of impression that I have is it's always important to ask, why do we have evidence on some of these environmental issues and we still face strong barriers to succeed in addressing the issues? And probably we have here some key elements to bear in mind when it comes to that negotiation, and also to address this global plastic issue. And the first element is one of the main starting point is the business as usual model is definitely not sustainable, and it's important to base our ambition on it. We cannot continue to do the same thing and to expect to have different results and to change finally our rationale about this plastic issue. So it's a very strong and very important element and starting point for us, this first element. The second one is probably that we have a different element where we should put our efforts according of the economic situation in the region. And it's very clear that, yes, we have to increase the resources, but the resources will not be used for the same element and to address the same issues depending on where we are, and globally we have a large range of action to undertake, and we really need to focus our efforts where it's relevant, depending to where we are in the world. And definitely for developing country as Gabon, the downstream issues, the waste management issues will be key in that process, and will be the important part of our contribution to the global efforts. And regarding your second question and the second aspect on the financial needs and resource, it's obvious that for plastic pollution as other global environmental issues, all sources are important and will be important to combat this question. As we talk about domestic and public finance or private resources, it's going to be very key to mobilize all type of sources, all types of actors to engage in financing the fight against plastic pollution. And lastly, I will also say that beyond the source of the finance, we also have the way we will invest even the existing resources in terms of sustainability. We really need to, let's say, reshape the way we invest in dealing with plastic issue, to make sure that while we're talking about production and consumption, or when we're talking about waste management system, we are very efficient in the use of existing resources. And then one of the key elements from this global agreement will be to set up global rules and set up a global understanding that we need to reinforce the responsibility, particularly when it comes to extended producer responsibility. So this global agreement should set up the scene and enabling environment to make sure that domestically we can definitely set up rules and elements that will drive more resources to address this question. So thank you at this stage, and I will be glad to answer a further question.
Thanks very much, Stanislas, for these observations. I mean, again, reinforcing what Robert said about the unsustainability of business as usual. But I think another key point that you made was that the specifics of the responses need to take the specific context of the region and with regard to financial needs and resources that you need to mobilize, resources from all sources. But we also need to reshape, how we use, how we invest. So it's not just about additional resources, it's also about redirecting current investments to be, more consistent with the objectives of the treaty. So now I do want to transition to Q&A. And to kick things off, I just wanted to go back to Rob and Elena, just to connect what Stanislas just said, that many of the responses need to be context and region specific. Now, in our modeling analysis, you have taken 10 sets of instruments, basically, and applied them with different levels of stringency around the world. So how do you balance that somewhat standardized approach with responses which might be much more nuanced and targeted, taking into account the particular context of different regions? So leave it open for you, whether Rob, you want to address it, or Elena, you want to address it.
I think I'll go first, and maybe Rob, you can see if you want to add anything. No, thank you for the question. So there were many questions in the chat around the instruments that we modeled and the pillars. So it's great to have an opportunity to clarify some of those elements. So the set of policies, 10 policy instruments that we modeled, is intended to be an example, not to be prescriptive of what are the instruments that should be adopted by all countries or should be in the text of the treaty. For example, the first pillar on curbing production and demand only has taxes, either focusing on packaging or on all plastics. That does not mean that the OECD is calling for taxes as the only instrument to be adopted to restrain plastics use. And in principle, any set of policies that can allow to achieve a similar outcome in terms of slowing down and reducing plastics demand, and in particular primary plastics use, is aligned with the scenario, the highest ambition scenario that we presented. So this could include a range of demand side measures, including, for instance, specific bans on problematic applications or polymers, criteria for eco-design, in particular when they allowed to maintain products and materials longer in the economy and reduce indirectly the demand for additional primary plastics to be produced, or even reuse targets. Supply side measures have also been discussed to some extent in the context of the treaty. And we should also mention that the removal of subsidies to fossil fuels and plastics productions should also be looked at and considered for removal. So there's a lot of different options that countries could consider, and responses in general should always be modeled on the basis of the local contexts that each country has. So for instance, in OECD countries where generally there is already a safe management systems that can adequately treat waste that is generated, the focus could be generally more on, for instance, improving even more external producer responsibility systems and incentivizing reuse or eco-design, while, as Stanislas also said, the priority in some developing countries can be to focus on making sure that there is a safe system for waste management. However, eventually, we know that we will need action on all 4 pillars. It's very clear from the scenario analysis that we need to take a life cycle approach if we are to eliminate leakage, and also if we want to reduce the costs of the transition. And especially in developing countries, it's important that action to also restrain demand is considered already now, because that's what can lead to the reduction in waste generation and also to the costs that are going to be required to improve waste management systems. So in the end, we do need action along the life cycle.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks very much, Elena. Rob, let me just pick up on that question, but maybe target it a bit more. There were a lot of questions about how did you determine the stringency of the policy instruments? So, for example, the level of plastic taxes that you applied in your scenarios. And a slightly different question, but it is somewhat linked, is, if you have policy instruments which are targeting plastics production, then you are in some ways inducing substitution away from plastics. But how do you take the life cycle impacts of those substitutes into consideration as well? Because someone pointed out in the Q&A that you might have substitutes which might be much heavier, and they may end up having other environmental impacts. So if you could just talk a little bit about how you quantify the stringency, and how do you deal with the life cycle impacts of the substitutes, vis-a-vis plastics?
Sure. So in terms of the stringency of the different instruments, basically what we started off with is looking at which instruments can serve as a kind of a reference point, as a cost-effective way of trying to achieve a certain effect. We know we want to reduce plastics use. We don't need to use taxes, but if you don't use taxes, you need other instruments to achieve the same types of reduction. So we have a fairly ambitious plastics tax in the model that is actually coming from the Global Plastics Outlook from 2022. And the idea, what we did in this report specifically, is ask the question, can we speed up that roadmap that we had for all these plastics policies until 2060? Can we speed that up until 2040? And then for some instruments, we find that you can do more and quicker. For other instruments, we find that there's limits on how much you can do. For example, the downstream scenario very clearly shows that the downstream policy instruments do not eliminate plastic leakage on their own if you have this increase in plastic waste. So for each instrument, we dived into the literature, we dived into what is possible, are there precedents in the world, for example, on the plastic tax? Does the EU have plastics fees that come in the same order of magnitude as what we have in the plastic tax? We think that our instruments are plausible, but very ambitious in the high stringency case, but not, exceptionally so, not unplausible anymore. But we do need this type of stringency in order to achieve the effects. So also we have looked from the end point of what do you need in order to eliminate this plastic leakage? How much do you need in the different pillars? The question on the substitutes and the environmental effects of substitutes is a very good one. We haven't done that analysis in detail. We have done earlier life cycle analysis of the plastics life cycle. And even there, we ran into big data problems and couldn't go beyond global assessment of the life cycle impacts. What we did here is we made an assessment of the extent to which plastic substitutes are a possibility. That is coming from the literature. We included that, but we haven't included an assessment of whether that is a net benefit or a net additional problem for the climate change and the other pollution. So that's why also we highlighted in the end that stringent mitigation policies are needed to make sure that the substitution, for example, is also going in the direction that is compatible with the Paris Agreement, and we don't get a shift from one set of emissions to another set of emissions through substitution.
Thanks very much, Rob. There's another question in the chat about the plausibility of the projections of future recycling rates. And one specific issue that's been raised is, do you assume that the polymer mix remains largely unchanged into the future? Or are you also looking at the feasibility of switching across polymers, perhaps moving towards polymers which might be more recyclable? And how does the substitution away from plastic polymers to other materials play a role, if at all, in the projections of the recycling?
I think I'll start on that one and then hand over to Elena to complement. Let me start by saying we're not technical experts. We're economists, right? We have an understanding of the plastics life cycle, and we have an understanding how it links to economic activity. And we do our analysis on the basis of that. I'm not a recycling expert. I know about chemical recycling, etc., at the rudimentary level. But So what we did is we looked at some of the literature on what is feasible in terms of recycling rates increases over time, and where is the limit. And we think that we have a plausible understanding that this overall recycling rate quadrupling to 42% might be feasible, and it includes several things, and it includes several barriers also to be overcome. First and foremost, reducing recycling losses is important. To what extent that means also a shift towards other polymers or ending unavoidable plastics, etc., and problematic polymers. I can't answer that in detail, but it's certainly part of it. But also part of it is improved innovation to ensure that recycling for those polymers that are currently not recycled is improved. Now, the 40% or 42% recycling rate doesn't mean that we need 40% recycling for all polymers. It is an average across all polymers that we need to achieve, and it varies widely across the different polymers how much recycling we foresee by 2040.
And just
Thanks
to
very much,
quickly
Elena.
add, yes, we do recognize this is very ambitious, especially, as Rob said, for polymers and applications that currently face very low recycling rates at the moment. And we only have 15 years to quadruple, essentially, the recycling rates globally. So what we also say in the reports, we understand there are technical challenges and a lot of innovation is going to be required. And should these innovations fail to materialize, then that's going to mean that in order to meet the objective of the scenarios, heightened ambition is going to be required on other pillars. So, for instance, reducing even more the demand for plastics, or scaling up even more upstream solutions.
Thanks very much, Elena. Then, I mean, first, let me just thank the audience. It's quite active on the Q&A front, and the questions are really good. So I'll try to ask as many as I can. Another set of issues is regarding mismanaged waste, and if you could just clarify how you define mismanaged waste, but also when you compute mismanaged waste, do you take into account waste trade?
Rob, you want to go first, actually?
Yeah, I want to focus on the waste trade. That's indeed something that we do look at. Although I always emphasize plastic waste trade actually has already come down in recent years by a significant amount, and total waste volumes, waste trade in plastic waste, I think is well below 10 megatons per year at the moment. So in that sense, it is an issue, but it's not as huge an issue as the total waste that is generated domestically. We include plastic waste trade, and it's always hard to identify what is the composition of the waste that is traded. So we have some background literature that gave us some clues on to what extent we deem some waste is actually exported to be recycled in other countries, for which we assume that there is a fairly high recycling rate. Other waste, plastic waste, is not necessarily exported for recycling purposes, or may indeed be not recycled even if it's exported for recycling purpose. So we have this mixture of the type of waste, depending on where it comes from and where it goes to, on what end-of-life fate this traded plastic waste meets. On mismanaged waste, I'll let Elena provide a definition, but it includes those types of plastic waste that is either not collected or that is improperly handled, such as through open dumping. But Elena, I think you have more details on that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the definition. So it's all waste that is not safely managed. So that includes, for instance, unsanitary landfilling, open air burning, or just disposal in the environment. I should mention that there are different ways of categorizing mismanaged waste and leakage in the literature. But yes, usually that's defined in the individual reports. Just very quickly on waste trades, Rob already explains the fact that we do take it into account in the modeling. Overall, the effect of waste trade, it's fairly small. But of course, it has happened in the past that exported plastic waste is of lower quality and not suitable for recycling. So it can happen, and then in the receiving country, it ends up dumped or not being recycled. And as Rob explained, that's taken care of in the model because any imported waste follows the end-of-life phase according to the waste management situation that there is in that specific country or region.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Elena. Yet another set of questions regarding this balance between primary plastics and secondary plastics, specifically that it's not a level playing field. I mean, this is an issue we've addressed at the OECD for a number of years, including a report we did on how to boost markets for secondary plastics. But the specific question is that if there is a significant price differential, if primary resins are much cheaper, I think the person posing the question said in some cases it might be a factor of 2. How do you actually boost markets for secondary plastics given significant price differentials?
Should I start off on this one, Elena, or do you want to go? I can give a very short answer as an economist, and that is it's both a demand push demand pull and supply push. So we need to enhance recycling capacity so that more scrap is produced, and if more scrap becomes available, that in principle also lowers the price of scrap, especially if we have policies that enhance recycling capacity, etc. At the same time, if you look at the policy package that we have, primary plastics production will not stay as cheap as it is now. We have all these upstream measures that will play a role in leveling the playing field and making sure that there is an economic case to be made for secondary plastics and make it competitive to primary plastics.
Yes, and as we also shown in the presentation, the reductions in especially in primary plastics use can be quite significant. So on the one hand, there is a reduction in total plastics use in 2040 compared to business as usual. And that's mainly achieved by the first 2 pillars, so interventions to slow down plastics demand and also to improve eco-design and extend the lifespan of products. But then looking specifically at primary plastics, so the charts that Rob showed with primary and secondary and the recycling rate going up, there a big role is also played by important improvements in recycling. And in order to achieve those, as we said, yes, we're going to need important innovations in recycling technologies, investments to take place, and also the right incentives for the markets to be there. So that includes both action on the demand side to pull demand for recycled content and interventions downstream to make sure that recycling rates goes up and there is recycling output of higher yields and quality that is available on the market.
Right, indeed. And I think some of the earlier work we did also highlighted the importance of creating differentiated demand for secondary plastics, and some of the instruments that you have modeled, including recycled content requirements, go precisely in that direction to create a more segmented market. There is a very interesting and different question, which is that, perhaps one of the key issues we're dealing with is plastics overcapacity. And there, the analogy that's put in the question is that OECD has been addressing the challenge of steel overcapacity for several years and trying to coordinate international responses in terms of how to address this problem of steel overcapacity. And the analogy is that, is there an issue with overproduction of primary plastics, and what might be some institutional responses in that direction? Maybe I'll put that question to our 2 government officials, don't want to put you on a spot, but if you want to take it on, Robert or Stanislas, I mean, is there an issue of plastics overcapacity, and is there need for other responses beyond what would be done in the context of the INC to address this bigger problem, which might be underlying, many of the environmental pressures that we are seeing?
I can give some reflections. Well, I think there's a difference between just an oversupply of plastics and the oversupply of primary polymers. So if we retain products within the economy, we create a circular economy. So plastics they're designed to be durable and reused. That will reduce the supply at the start. So I think it's clear that there is somewhat an oversupply, as we mentioned before, because the amount of plastics that are being used and created cannot be sustainably managed by the waste management capacity that we do have. So it's clear that the current level is not sustainable. I'm not sure if that's quite the same as being an oversupply, but it's certainly not sustainable. And the treaty does need to address that. There are other voluntary initiatives. Industry has some voluntary initiatives like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Global Commitment, which some businesses, many global producers of plastics and users are part of, to try and reduce it themselves voluntarily. But it's clear that we do need a global agreement. Plastic use, leakage to the environment continue to grow despite these voluntary initiatives. So yeah, I would say that we do need an agreement to address this. It's a global and transboundary issue, and it's the kind of thing where multilateralism is needed.
Thanks very much, Robert. Stanislas, do you have any observations on that?
Thank you. Maybe very briefly on this, as in the context of Gabon, we are more consumer than producer of plastics, but definitely two elements that are of importance for us. The first one is where we were preparing, for instance, our single-use plastic law. We found out that some of the companies selling plastics here to markets and all of this have a common question or answer, which was that it's so cheap plastic, so they buy huge amount and they know they will just sell it because it's very cheap and you have a huge demand on the market. So that's create a non-sustainable use of plastic and generate a huge amount of waste that they can finally find in the environment. The second element, which is key in terms of the negotiation, is of course we need to have a very high ambition. Gabon is a member of High Ambition Coalition and really support ambition in this agreement. But as I said before, we won't have an agreement that will be one size fits all. We will need the agreement to touch different elements and set the same to different solutions where countries will individually be able to apply locally what is the more relevant in terms of action to address it. So we have to definitely be ambitious, but to focus on relevant action to address a specific context.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Stanislas. There is perhaps this question is also I'd like to direct it to Stanislas and Robert, and this is related to access to international financing, and the question is, are there any suggestions for increasing access to funding for the physical solutions that are needed to deal with the massive amount of plastic waste, particularly in many developing countries?
Maybe I will start on this. the question of access to finance, it's always complicated because we have an issue where we need a very quick action on the ground, very quick investment, particularly in developing countries, to address this issue. But in the meantime, we can understand that it's always complicated to set up a financial mechanism where you quickly disburse funds and you quickly mobilize resources. So we need to have a two-step approach. I think the first one will be, how can we definitely mobilize the immediate resources that country may need in terms of strategic action and in terms of planning and addressing the direct action we can do. And at the second step will be a more sustainable processes will support country in setting up all the mechanism we need to generate the resource, to mobilize the resource in terms of definitely governance, but also without a strong planification in terms of investment, it's really difficult to have efficient use of the resources. So access to finance will definitely be a challenge, but we will need to be able to mobilize short-term resources to address quick actions, and then set up the long-term processes where we will have a biggest amount of resources, more engagement of private sector and international resources that will support the action in a very sustainable context. So that is our view on this specific point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stanislas. Robert?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Stanis has said. We do need an increase in the finance, but it's also important to think about what we mean by that. There needs to be finance mobilised from a wide variety of sources, both public, private, domestic, and international. The funding gap to end plastic pollution by 2040 is quite large. I think it's estimated between 350 and 500 billion. That's the finance needs. That's not going to come from one source. It will have to come from both public and private. I think it's important to think about what the treaty can do to encourage parties to the treaty to create a domestic enabling environment, so there can be self-sustaining architecture that does increase the uptake of finance, and think about where finance is most appropriate from which sources. So public finance is best suited to funding downstream measures, waste management infrastructure, etc. And private finance tends to be most suited to upstream measures, investing in circular design, phasing out problematic and avoidable products, and as well as exploring alternative and substitute materials. So I think it's important to think of what we mean by financing and bringing in financing from all sources, because that's what we're going to need to close that funding gap.
Thanks very much, Robert. We are nearing the end of this event. Let me first invite Rob and Elena if they have any final observations, and then to our two INC negotiators, let me just pose the question and give you 15 to 20 seconds to think about it. Looking ahead, what do you see as the key priorities and hopes for the next round of negotiations coming up in Busan? But while you think about it, let me just invite Elena and Rob if they have any final remarks, very brief remarks.
Just thank you all for joining us today, and I think we're looking forward to INC 5 and disseminating the key findings from the report.
Rob,
yeah, I'm a bit more lofty. I think we need to keep in mind that the objective is ending plastics pollution, not ending plastics itself. We need to curb demand, and we need to generate less of it and handle it better as we do, and thereby end pollution. But it's not a war on plastics that we're in.
Thanks very much, Rob. So let me start with you, Stanislas. Expectations from Busan.
Thank you, Shardul. Our biggest expectation is to make sure that in Busan we can come out with a common global understanding that we cannot continue this way. We have to put our highest possible ambition on the table to make sure we get an agreement that lead globally the world to a world without plastics, and to be also pragmatic. We know that ambition will not be enough. We will need to deliver on the ground. So we have also to be realistic on the way we will implement this agreement. So we need ambition, we need pragmatism, and we need to be all together looking at the same direction when it comes to this fight against plastic. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Stanislas. Robert?
Thank you, Shardul. Well, our immediate hope is that we get an agreement. The ambition of the INC is to complete its work by the end of 2024, and the INC 5 in Busan is the final negotiating session in the UK. We're determined to fill that ambition and come out of that meeting with an agreement. But that agreement should, as Stanislas said, be one that is capable of ending plastic pollution, one that addresses the full life cycle of plastics. As we've heard in this webinar, that's what we need. But it does need to be a treaty that is implementable, one that's practical, and one that works for everyone. So yes, I'm hoping that we come away from INC 5 with an ambitious agreement that is capable of putting us on a path towards ending plastic pollution.
Thanks very much, Robert. And we wish you both, but also the other negotiating teams, all the best, and look forward to a successful outcome in Busan. Let me conclude by thanking my colleagues, Rob Dellink and Elena Buzzi, for an excellent presentation, and our very active audience who've been, very keenly following the insights, but also been very interactive. So thank you very much for an excellent edition of Green Talk Live. And we will be uploading the webcast and the slides for today on our website. The book that was launched today is already available online, and I look forward to seeing you in the next edition of OECD's Green Talk Live. Thank you very much, and goodbye from Paris.